Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark. When Nighttime Falls, Volume 4, Story Number 1. In Ohio, a few years back, I was on my grandfather's land doing some hiking with a cousin. Eventually, we got off the beaten path and went deeper into the woods, around a mile or so to be exact, and walked upon a small stream. As soon as we walked upon the stream, a horrible smell hit our nose. Something had died and was close by. But it wasn't your normal rotten animal smell. It was much, much worse. Never paying attention to the phrase, "curiosity killed a cat," we ventured onward, following the smell and the stream. We walked a couple of 100 yards and a small clearing opened up. In the clearing we discovered dozens of dead animals. A couple of horses, a couple of cows, and the rest were sheep and goats. Some had been dead for quite some time. They had decomposed and were nothing but bones, but others had died more recently. Some up to a week, possibly. The scariest part was some of the animals were missing their heads. Others had their stomachs completely torn out. We hastily made our way back up the stream and practically ran back to the main trail. Some will say there could be a farm nearby and that's the site they dumped their dead animals. Honestly, I felt it was too deep in for that. And that still doesn't explain the missing heads. Could it be a cult? Who knows? I never went back there though. Now, around that time, a friend and me, we were back in the woods a few miles. It was on my family's property and we were metal detecting. They own over 600 acres and we were in deep, to say the least. We walked out of the woods into a large clearing with an old barn my family used to house tobacco in years ago. We decided to spend a couple of hours there looking for anything of value. After an hour digging under the hot sun, we noticed something very unsettling about the clearing, and in particular the barn. Everything was deathly quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing. And once we thought about it, we realized it had been that quiet since we walked out into the clearing. The longer we stayed, the worse it got. The silence of the clearing began to change into a feeling of dread and at times fear for me and for my friend. The dreadful feeling was mainly coming from the barn, and we quickly gathered our gear and made our way out of the woods. Came to find out from my mother years ago, before I was even born, her uncle had been hunting around that same area at night when he said a large hairy beast, standing upright, came rushing out of the woods after him. He claimed it chased him, and he ran back home so hard and fast he nearly died of exhaustion. Who knows if he's truthful? He rarely talks about what happened, and when he does, it's creepy to see his facial features while telling it. To clarify this, he claimed it was a werewolf. Both situations had the hair on my neck standing straight up. Whether it was a predator that we know of or something else, I don't know. But I've yet to go back to either area, and I probably won't. Story number 2. I'm going to tell you a story my father told me about. My father and I both served in the Marine Corps, however. So you can imagine he served way before I did. He served in Vietnam in 1967 near the DMZ. The first time my father told me this story, it gave me chill bumps. I hope I can do it justice and remember all the facts. He said that in late 1967, his company had been running patrols along the DMZ, occasionally making short but violent contacts with the NVA. He said they had set up their night defensive position in a very thick section of woods in the jungle. He said that around midnight, it was his turn to stand watch. He said that he sat next to a large tree with his rifle beside him and a clacker for a claymore mine in his right hand. He said that the darkness was so black that you couldn't see your hand in front of your face, and they depended more on hearing movement than seeing it. He said that after a while, the fog began to envelop the position. Now, he said that the thicket they had set up in was extremely thick, and anyone moving through it would have to make noise, and that's why it had been chosen. He said that as he sat there, he began to get very nervous and felt that something was not right. He said he couldn't hear or see a thing, but knew that there was something close by, and he felt an attack was imminent. He said he turned to look at his buddy to see if he was asleep, but as he did, he saw movement out of the corner of his eye. He swung his head around, ready to detonate his claymore, but froze instantly, completely overcome with fear. He said that standing in front of him was a short little man, holding a pike and wearing a sword. He was covered from head to toe in Spanish armor from the conquistador period. My father said the little man just stood there and looked at him. Finally, the conquistador said 3 or 4 words to him in a language he didn't understand. My father said that the little man then turned and walked into the fog without making a sound. My father said that when it was over, he realized that he was completely covered in sweat. He said it was the scariest thing he'd ever experienced. He memorized the words the man said to him, intending to ask some of the Hispanics in his unit what they meant. But when he did, they said it was in Spanish and didn't know what he was saying. After returning from Vietnam that night, it still bothered him so much he did some research and found that the Spanish had fought in that area centuries before. He continued to ask about the words the man had said to him, but no one seemed to know what it was. Finally, he asked a friend with some extensive education and learned it was Latin. The words translated into "Don't forget to die." Apparently, he had done just that. Maybe a wise warning from an old soldier. I can't remember the Latin words that my father told me, but he can never forget them. Next story. Before my wife and I got married and had children, we used to hike a lot. The more difficult and steeper the terrain, the better. We liked the difficult hikes because less people were on the trails. If anyone knows the kind of toolboxes that hike in Northern California, then you understand why we preferred to avoid heavily trafficked areas. Anyways, one weekend during the summertime, we were hiking in a coastal mountain area where we had a 17-mile hike planned that would be a couple of 1,000 feet change in elevation. We left the car and started walking to the trailhead, seeing a few other hikers. Once we got to the interconnect trail that would take us up the mountain, we pretty much stopped seeing other hikers. We eventually climbed the interconnect and got on the main trail that runs along a ridge and ascends and descends frequently and steeply. The difficulty of this particular trail is what keeps it empty. After we had been on the main trail for a couple of miles, I started to get the feeling of being watched. I looked off to both sides of the trail and didn't see or hear anything, so I ignored it. A bit later, we started hearing crunching and cracking of leaves and branches off to our left side. By this point, the entire forest had gone pretty silent. No birds or squirrels are letting us know they're around. When we stopped, the noises continued for a couple of seconds, then stopped as well. This went on for a couple of miles or so, and we were trying to ignore it and keep going. As we were a mile or so out from the turnaround point, we saw a post hammered into the ground right by the left side of the trail. The post wasn't the standard 4x4 that is usually used for trailheads, smaller and had a hole drilled through near the top of it. We thought it was odd to see that there, as there's no trailhead, but we just decided to keep going. We eventually reached our turnaround point and decided to have a snack. As we were heading back, we again passed the post with a hole in it. Only now the hole has a stick jammed through it. We hadn't seen any other hikers for the last couple of hours, and we were now starting to get more than a little unsettled. We continued back the way we came and again heard the crunching, cracking noises and got the feelings of being watched. After a few minutes of this, I stopped on the trail and waited for the noises to stop. When the forest became quiet, I pulled my Glock out of my pack and jacked around in the chamber. The noise of that probably carries pretty well, which I then put back in the holster and in my waistband. We both felt safer and continued down the mountain. As we were approaching the more popular, in other words, easier places to hike, a middle-aged man and woman approached us. They asked if we had seen any teenage boys up there where we had been to. Still being a bit uneasy, I answered nope, and pushed past them and walked back to my car. I have a couple of ideas on what the noises could have been. 1. Teenage boys horsing around. 2. Being stalked by a mountain lion. 3. Pot growers using public lands to grow their herbs. I highly doubt it was a mountain lion, even though we have seen quite large tracks in that area. I'm leaning more towards the pot growers. So when I got home, I laid out the map and looked at the trail. There's several water sources off to the side where we heard the noises, not to mention it's secluded and a lightly traveled region. This would also explain the marked poster that we found. I haven't been back since. I really hope it was growers and that I didn't make some silly teenager crap their pants when I pulled the Glock out. Next story. I don't know if any of you are familiar with British Columbia, but in almost any city or town, you're usually pretty close to wilderness there. I've had bears sleeping in my front yard, a family of moose in the backyard every year, and I've spotted coyotes less than a block from my house. All of this in a city of 90,000 people. Anyway, a few years ago, a friend and I decided to take a hike along a large plateau about 1 kilometer from my house and planned to be back before dark. Unfortunately, we hiked too far out, and it was night before we were even halfway back. Without a reliable light between the two of us, we decided to just follow the trail until we got back to the car. Most of the trip was entirely uneventful until we got to the trail leading down from the plateau into the city. As we walked, I heard a sound directly in front of us and told my friend to stop immediately. I can't really describe the sound. It was somewhere between a grunt and a growl. It most certainly didn't sound like a bear, but some other large predator. It was close, but just out of range of the puny LED light on my cell phone. Calmly, I hit record on my phone, stretched my arms out to my side, and started backing away slowly. I told my friend to do the same and not to make any sudden movements. I could feel and hear my heartbeat in my temples as we slowly backed down the trail to find an alternate place to descend from the plateau. After what felt like an eternity, amplified by a few more ambiguous snarl grunt sounds ahead of us, we decided to slide down a part of the plateau that was relatively smooth compared to the sandstone cliffs everywhere else. The whole time I was recording the darkness of night on the video camera of my phone. We came to an old road that skirted along below the plateau that I knew would take us to where we parked the car. As we trekked on, I can remember the only thing going through my mind was, whatever was on the trail is going to make dinner out of us. Eventually, we made it to the car and left. The walk back had taken a lot out of both of us. It was extreme fear and stress, stretched over probably 45 minutes until we got back to the car. Once we got back to my house, we decided to watch the footage I took. Most of the footage was nothing but darkness, but as we passed where we encountered whatever it was that made us take an alternate way down from below, there was a very distinct and rather large set of green eyes that watched and followed us along that road until we got back to the vehicle. The color and size of the eyes made me discount the usual predators in the area. Coyotes' eyes don't shine that color, and neither do bears. The only thing I could think of would be a cougar, and it sat on the ridge and watched us get back in the car. Sure enough, the next day on the local news, there was word of a large mountain lion being spotted not far at all from where my friend and I were hiking. It still gives me goosebumps, thinking that it was literally a few feet in front of me. I'm certain that things would have gone quite differently if I had been hiking alone or didn't know how to handle coming across a large predator in the wild. And all of this, of course, was well inside the city limits to top it off. Next story. Not just in the Victorian era. It was relatively common for people to keep exotic pets in the UK right up until the 1980s when licensing laws were brought in. Pumas were popular because they are slightly less dangerous than an African lion, but still carried the novelty factor of someone having a lion in their garden. I remembered well as a child that a man kept one in his garden nearby, right in the center of England. You could buy an African lion from Harrods in the 1970s. No background checks, no special requirements. Just pay at the till, put it in the car, and leave. When those new laws came in, meaning people had to have suitable enclosures and facilities for their exotic pets, it's believed that some irresponsible owners simply let their pets escape, rather than have to stump up for either cages, licenses, or to find proper homes for them. Because no records were kept on how many were actually out there beforehand, no one knows how many have gotten out into the countryside. In 1997, a friend and I were delivering some stuff to a private school near here where I live. There were no pupils about. It was the summer holidays, but the headmaster was having a family get-together and was in the chapel having some sort of service. We were led into a study to wait, typical old-time affair, lots of polished mahogany, leather Chesterfields, and shelves of old-bound books. Standing at the head's desk, looking out into the spacious grounds, we could see down an avenue of trees, which must have been the main entrance at one time. At the far end, we watched a cat emerge from the undergrowth, stalk across the gap between the trees, heading into the shrubs on either side. I nudged my mate without taking my eyes off the cat and said, "I hope you're seeing what I'm seeing down there." "What?" "That's an effing lion," came the reply. It was very muscular. You could see the power and strength in it even from where we were, and I told him to note the size of the shrubs, which came up to its shoulders. It moved like no domestic cat I've ever seen, sleek, but with that big cat swagger. For me, the black end of the tail was a deciding factor, and stupid though it may seem, I wanted to see this creature up close. I was out through the French windows and down the avenue to where the cat had been. No sign of it, but the shrubs were up to my thigh. I'm convinced that we saw puma, though the cat was colored close to that of a fox. I do see foxes regularly, up close and far away, and this was not a fox. When the head came to fetch us from the study, I asked him straight out, "Who does the puma belong to?" Interestingly, in my eyes anyway, he didn't react, even when I followed up with, "You must have seen that big cat around here. It's huge." He simply shrugged and said, "I don't know what you mean," and led us away. End of discussion. In my mind, at least, I would think that someone who was in charge of dozens of 9 to 13-year-old children in term time at a boarding school should have been just a little concerned when two people say they've seen a lion wandering about in the grounds, even if it is just to assure them it was a mistaken identity. Apparently not. Then again, if I was aware of a big cat in the locale, I wouldn't want to broadcast the fact. It would mean certain death for the creature. I'll take my chances while out in the countryside. I'm more concerned about people than big cats. Well, this is another story. It didn't happen to me, but to a friend, whose parents had a sheep farm in Wales. They were getting on a bit, so he sent them away on a cruise and held the fort for them. One night, he was locking up when he had that feeling he was being watched. The farm dogs were going mental, but not prepared to chase into the darkness after the intruder. Animals which were in the farmyard were also very restless, the horses kicking the stable doors, etc. My friend's a big man. He was brought up on that farm, wasn't scared of the dark, but he said he did feel scared that night. Anyway, as soon as it started, it dropped off and everything went quiet. Next day he was out in the fields and found an eviscerated sheep. That night he was ready for whatever had killed the sheep, if it came back for seconds, with his rifle and night vision scope, which he may or may not have appropriated from his mates in the army. Amazing some of the stuff which accidentally finds its way into Civvy Street. Anyway, as he did his rounds again last thing, the animals kicked off once more. He said he could feel eyes upon him, watching him, hateful eyes. Up with a rifle, scanning the surrounding area, he could see sheep bunched up in a field, their eyes glowing. Then he saw another pair of eyes looking at him, different color to the sheep. The eyes blinked, and their owner ducked down, as if aware he was staring back, then reappeared further along the hedge line. The word he used to describe the eyes was demonic, which is a bit melodramatic for a man like him. Whatever was there seemed to be circling the farm, watching, and he said he thought it was looking for a way in, although he wasn't going to put around into anything without identifying it properly first. The intruder seemed aware he was tracking it with a rifle and made no move to approach. Again, as before, suddenly they were gone. The animal settled down, and he said the atmosphere immediately lifted. Anyway, over the next few nights, the pattern was repeated. The animals became restless in their oppression, and him tracking a pair of evil eyes as something probed for a way into the yard past him. I can't recall whether he lost any more sheep, but he was unnerved by the creature, which brought a negative feeling and which seemed to be well aware he was pointing a weapon at it. After a week or so, it stopped, and it became the old farm he knew as a kid. It became home again. Later that month, a neighboring farm, which had been losing animals, shot dead an intruder. turned out to be a wolverine. Now, Wales is a long way from Russia or the Nordic countries they normally live in, and no zoos reported escapes, but it certainly came from somewhere. Next story. Once I was camping about 12 miles north of Garberville, California, and I had a pretty scary night. After everyone had eaten dinner and cleaned up camp, we all headed to our tents. Usually my friend and his girlfriend would stay up a while playing their Nintendo 3Ds. We actually lived in the woods at the time, so I was used to hearing people talking quietly and laughing. Well, I fell asleep. Then I had a nightmare that I was being dragged out of the camp and was screaming for someone to help, and whoever was dragging me seemed straight up evil. In my dream, there was the sound of a girl giggling while I was screaming for help. I don't remember much else from the dream except the overtone that I was being dragged to a well. When I woke up in the morning, I decided to go exploring around the side of the hill. We hadn't been there because of a huge poison oak patch, and we ran our water from the other side. I took my buddy and we walked about as far as I remember being dragged in the dream. We found an abandoned car from at least the 50s or earlier. So we pushed on. We ended up finding foundations and a large water tank, all covered in second growth and rusted through. What did I find right down the trail from the water tank? An effing well. Like the well from The Ring or something, cover and all. We opened it and saw the creepiest thing ever. The ladder, barely still hanging together, had the top 10 rungs broken off, so someone might have actually been killed or thrown into it. Next story. I was an outdoors instructor at a private school up near French Gulch, California, at the edge of the Trinity Mountains. We were at the end of the road. Each night, one of the male employees would walk the line of cabins, then cross the creek on a wooden suspension bridge, and walk by the boys' cabins up in the woods. A total walk of about a half mile, all totally in the dark. No yard lights, no one else up. Start at midnight, be done by 1 a.m. In the middle of the headquarters side was the cookhouse, sitting right on the creek side. The bridge started there and went across about 6 feet above the creek. The creek was about 4 feet wide, but the creek bed was some 20 to 25 feet, covered in head-sized boulders. The cookhouse had a rack of the trash cans on the dark side of the building, above the creek, under the eaves and overhanging oak trees. I completed the walk of the headquarters side and then headed up the hill to the boys' cabins. Nothing stirred, and within 15 or 20 minutes, I had started back towards the bridge. The bridge had two 16 feet 8 by 8 posts at each end, supporting wire cables that ran down to the deck and back up to the uprights on the other side. The bridge deck planks were about 4 by 10. The bridge was old, and even setting foot on it would start swaying and undulating, making loud creaking noises. As I got to one end of the bridge, I could hear something banging around the trash cans, but the noise didn't really come into the front of my mind until I was past the first part of the bridge and actually on the suspended part. As the bridge creaked and swayed, I heard a woof, and a trash can clattered down into the creek. Oh crap, I thought. A bear. My problem was I was on the bridge, with the bear between me and my trailer. There was no one I could call out to. This was before cell phones, and even if I had screamed bloody murder, no one would hear me. I was thinking that if the bear ran across the creek towards me, he would be between me and the large boulders. If he ran to the bridge and came towards me, I was in trouble that way too. If he ran towards the house or towards my place, I was screwed there too. I backed up, keeping my eye on the area next to the cookhouse. However, it was deeply black, and I couldn't see anything over there. I kept thinking, let it be a raccoon, let it be a bobcat. But I also knew nothing that small would throw a full trash can 20 or 30 feet into the creek. I felt my foot touch the ground and quickly squatted down and picked up 2 cantaloupe-sized rocks. I shifted one of the rocks into the crook of my left arm and picked up another with my right hand. Now I was armed for the bear. I started walking forward again onto the bridge and started tromping so I could maybe scare the beast away. About halfway across, I tossed the smallest of the rocks under the eaves and heard a crash as it struck a trash can. I heard another woof and suddenly in the dark saw a huge shape stand erect. When the head and shoulders rose above the edge of the eaves of the cookhouse, I said, no way. No way that's a bear standing on a trash can. My knees started to get a little weak. With another grunt, the animal huffed, stooped over, and banged trash cans every which way, proceeded to trot out to the open area at the end of the bridge. Still hooked over, the thing slowly came onto the far end of the bridge. I didn't want to turn my back on it and run back to the end of the bridge, since that was further away from help, and I was sure not going to drop off the bridge and break a leg, landing on polished boulders in the dark. No way could I run in the dark on the creek bed either. The thing continued to shamble forward until it came off the landing and out onto the bridge proper. I wound up and threw my next rock. It was big, so I couldn't get a good throw, but it landed at the thing's feet. It jumped back, still hunched over. The force of its jump really jolted the bridge. I almost fell over. As the bridge lurched and swayed, I backed up, and again this damn thing came forward. Now, I was near the cable on one side, so I started jumping up and down, trying to get the bridge really undulating. I had one more rock, and I wasn't going to waste it. I thought if it came near me, I would raise it and bash it on the head. Sweat was running down my face and neck, soaking my chest and back. The thing suddenly stood up to its full height. It was at least 10 feet tall, and as nearly as I could tell, somewhat man-shaped rather than bear or ape-shaped. It spread its hands and reached from one cable to the other, which was at least 10 feet wide. Suddenly I became aware of a strong, foul stench. My stomach rolled. This thing had some powerful funk. Wow, nasty. I lost all energy. I just stood there. I dropped my rock. The crack of the rock seemed to waken me, and I stooped down to pick it up. I heaved it towards the beast, which was a good 30 feet away. It landed about 5 feet in front of it and rolled towards it. The beast gave another grunt and pulled the uphill cable, leaped over it, and landed on the rocks below. I could hear it running upstream, headed into the deeper forest, which borders Trinity Lake on the southeast side. I stood there until I could no longer hear anything. I realized I was shivering and soaking wet. I walked back quickly to my trailer at the far end of the headquarters side of the compound. I felt like that thing was following me the entire way. When I slid open the door and stepped inside, my wife looked up from where she was reading a book and said, "What's wrong with you?" I haven't been back there in almost 40 years, but if the property's still there, then every foot of the entire story can be walked out a step at a time, at the end of that paved road, north of French Gulch. Next story. This happened a few years ago. It was around 1 a.m. and I was sitting in my living room watching TV. The Roddy's lying next to me on the floor, the wife is sleeping, and all the lights are off. To someone outside, it would seem all is asleep in the house. The TV is in front of a large window. The window has a curtain over it, except for one small corner at the bottom of the window, where the curtain is pulled back, so that we can see people stepping onto the porch during the day from the couch. Again, the exposed portion of the window is very small, and for someone to look inside, they would have to bend down or be extremely short. Suddenly, my Roddy raised her head, put her ears back, and showed her teeth, and then began to let out a low growl. She stared directly at the exposed corner of the window. I muted the TV, and after a minute, her growling became snarls. She got up on all fours, lowered her head, and kept staring at the corner. I quickly grabbed my 9mm, ducked under the TV, and made my way to the front door. I tried to listen for any noise, but all I could hear was my very angry dog. After a few minutes of this, I flipped on the porch light and looked through the front door window. There was nothing there. Soon after, my dog chilled and all seemed to be well. I went to bed, but it was a sleepless night. Fast forward a few nights. My wife was in bed, the Roddy sleeping in the other room, and I'm pulling another late-nighter, watching some mindless garbage on TV. I decided to go to bed. Before I go, I figured I'd do a quick patrol around our house and the in-laws' property. I grabbed my mag light, loaded the Glock, and made my way outside. The moon was bright, so I left the porch light off. Once I stepped on the porch, I I noticed movement to the right of me, where my driveway and the vehicles are located. I shine my light towards the movement and see a large creature or animal next to my car. It's on two legs, with its front legs or arms on the top of my car, with its back to me. It's got brown hair, also very hairy, slim, and lean. Once the light hits it, it rushed off towards the road, hit the pavement, and ran into the woods. All of this without making a sound. I wasn't able to get a good look at it. My eyes had yet to fully adjust, and the whole ordeal only lasted about 5 seconds. I never saw its head or face, but it was completely silent as it ran on gravel, then on pavement, then into the woods. I heard nothing, as if it floated into the woods. It could have been a cougar or some other animal, but considering what happened just the night before, the whole situation made my hair stand up, and I quickly made my way back inside, hoping, of course, that it was just a cougar, but not quite convinced. Next story. A buddy and myself bought some kayaks to use for fishing. Early in the summer, a few years ago, we decided to do a quick shakedown trip to a local lake. We loaded up our stuff, headed off to the lake, and put in at the non-motorized cove. Over the period of the afternoon, we paddled and fished our way back into the canyon. Around 6 p.m., we arrived at the end of the canyon, pulled our boats out of the water, and started to make camp. Due to the time of year, it was entirely too hot to eat or even sleep. It was 115 degrees in May. We sat up in the rocks, sitting in deep grooves carved by thousands of years of wind and water, talking about pretty much everything. We watched the moon come up over the canyon wall, light up the entire valley behind us, and set back over the adjacent canyon wall. There were bats and owls flying around. All sorts of nocturnal creatures were active. So, late into the night, approximately 2 or 3 a.m., in a bit of a lull in the conversation, my buddy turns to me and says, "Do you hear voices?" I replied, "No one is back here. We're a good 7 or 8 miles from anywhere." About that time, we both heard a very loud, very hollow bonk sound coming from the water's edge. It was the sound of a kayak called beaching on the boulders. We immediately drew our attention towards the shoreline, only to find 4 men standing upright with 3 more still in kayaks. We both sat in silence for 5 seconds, completely and totally surprised that someone paddled so deep into the canyon in the middle of the night. We saw no one else the entire day. Once we were out of sight of the parking lot, my body managed to eke out a weak, "Hey guys, how's it going?" And I sat there in the deep groove of the rock, with my brain screaming, "This is bad." When we garnered no reply from the men whatsoever, and the additional 3 began to come ashore, I scurried over to the tents and reached into mine to retrieve a gun. In all my wilderness kayaking virgin glory and ignorance, I packed a semi-auto clone of an M11 9mm. I packed it as my rifle was tough to finagle in and out from below deck of the kayak. Additionally, I packed a pistol and the 2 32-round magazines. My rationale was that this was a lot of firepower in a small compact package, and butcher paper wrapped in packaging tape. Frantically tearing at the paper to retrieve the weapon and make ready, I could taste the adrenaline in my mouth and my ears ringing from fear. After successfully retrieving the pistol while remaining relatively out of sight of the 7 men, I slid back down into the groove in the rock next to my buddy. He gave another shaky, "Hey guys," again with absolutely no answer. At that point, I inserted a magazine into the pistol and chambered around. At this point, my brain went from screaming, "This is bad," to "This is bad and I really wish this had a stock." Now, all the men stopped where they were standing. They continued to stand in the fading moonlight for no less than 10 minutes, completely motionless and completely silent. The men never said one single word from the time we were alerted to their presence. After the longest 10 minutes of my life, with my heart thumping in my chest, throat, and ears, peering over the rocks from our makeshift hiding place, the men simultaneously walked backwards, piled into their kayaks, and paddled backwards for 50 yards around the last bend in the canyon and out of sight. The men never said a single word, never communicated through any form, and never acknowledged our presence other than watching us the entire time. To this day, I'm unconvinced as to whether they were back there with some ill intentions toward us, ill intentions in general, or any combination in between. It was definitely creepy in the vein that so much happened with no explanation for why it happened. As soon as I returned home, I spent time and figured out how to fit a rifle into the kayak. Since that trip, I always take a rifle anytime I head out of town.